Firstly, to say welcome to everybody and thank you for joining us today. And just at the top of the programme, thanks very much to Jocelyn for organising everything, and to Lucy Drake-Lee, who's the scheme manager at B2B Compliance. Thank you, Lucy, for taking us through the changes to the regulations today. I have to say, WEEE has been ingrained in our association's culture since it was first hatched by the European Commission back in the late 90s, early thousands of the century, and we were very active in assisting and supporting the scoping of the original casting of the WEEE, as it was the WEEE and ROS regulations, or directives I should say, as they were transposed into UK law. And I'm sure many of you will remember that there was significant discussion over the role of household products and commercial kitchen equipment. And the result of that was that commercial kitchen equipment falls under the scope of WEEE. And since then, there's been a further recast of the directive. But what I would say is all of this is leading to the bigger picture of addressing the issues of climate change and the circular economy principles that as now the FEA, we are firmly adhering to as part of our development work. And just as a heads up, we have established a net zero carbon group within the FEA, looking at the issues of circular economy principles as they relate to food service equipment. So if you haven't already responded to the call for that, please do so, but we'll be sending the link out again. We are recording this webinar so that others can use it at a later date, or indeed that you can refer back to it. And there will be a question and answer facility. So please use the chat to put in your questions, and I'll ask Jocelyn to collate those and present them back to Lucy at the end of her session. So really that concludes my element of today, and delighted to hand over to Lucy to take us through an overview of the regulations. And I would say, just before Lucy starts, we've been involved with B2B compliance since that start of the programme and the requirements for a compliance scheme in the UK. B2B compliance was established by a group of trade associations on a not-for-profit basis to ensure that the costs and the risk associated with compliance schemes were eliminated. And we're delighted to have been a signatory to the original representation of B2B compliance in the market. And I'm sure many of you are still using B2B compliance since that date, or are perhaps looking to change schemes and may wish to consider B2B compliance to provide the services. So that's enough from me. Thanks very much, Lucy. Delighted to hand over to you.
No problem. Thanks, Keith. Yeah, it's great to be here to do a webinar to you all today. I'm going to be running over an overview of the WEEE regulations, but please do ask me any weird and wonderful questions. I'm sure that most of you are registered under the WEEE regulations, but this will help those of you that aren't registered that you might need to be registered. And for those of you that are already registered, it will be a recap and just a little bit of a view into the future. So I love questions, so make sure you ask questions, and hopefully this is insightful for all of you, whether you're registered or not registered. So first of all, we'll just go over the background to the regulations. I'll then go on to producer obligations and basically what would make you an obligated producer. And that just runs into EEE Scoping. Obviously, most of you will have E in a similar category. Then we'll run over the costs involved. So that often involves membership and EA costs, as well as financing the recycling of the WEEE at the end of its life. And obviously there's compliance deadlines within that as well, which we can quickly run over. Perfect. So a background to the regulations then. So as you will all probably know, the EU released a directive on WEEE, which is why the UK have transposed regulations out of that. So the first directive came into force in 2002, that was WEEE 1, and then WEEE 2 came in 2012. And the aim of this was basically to prevent the negative effect of WEEE on the environment. and also to encourage reuse and recycling of WEEE. So a lot of you, I would imagine, will be registered in countries outside of the UK as well. So every country in the EU follows these directives, but each country in the EU will have their own regulations. So everyone's interpreted it slightly differently. So for those of you that are registered in multiple countries, it can get very confusing. So the regulations that we work to now are the 2013, which is basically, they just did a bit of a staggered introduction to the regulations, part one in 2005 and then part two in 2013. So in 2013, the differences were sort of outlining how B2B obligations are different to B2C obligations, and things like that. Now we're just upcoming a consultation on the regulations again, which will happen this year. So these regulations are due to change again to encourage even more reuse and things like that. So we are incredibly involved in sort of influencing the consultation. So if anyone's got any questions on that, then please do ask. Actually, what I am also going to mention here is Brexit. I always miss Brexit out of my presentation simply because we're not affected by Brexit at all, really, in terms of the WEEE regulations. All it means is that in the future, we don't have to strictly follow the EU directives, but it's UK legislation, and therefore it really doesn't change much at all. But it's worth mentioning just to put all of your minds at rest. Perfect. So we're now in this transition period. Open scope only came in 2019, but we can cover that in terms of scoping a bit later. Fab. So what would mean that you are obligated under the legislation? So a producer of E is someone that manufactures E, rebrands E, or imports E. There's also distance selling, which is similar. And we're going to cover all of these definitions a little bit later. But it's important to define a producer first. So this is basically the person that places the E on the UK market. So if you are an obligated producer, there are certain things you need to do. You need to register. There are two types of registration. One is a large producer, and that's anyone that places more than 5 tons of E on the market per year. And a small producer is anyone that places under 5 tons of E on the market. There's no minimum under that. So even if some companies might place 1 item on the market per year, they still need to be registered as an E producer. After registering, you need to report. So there's slightly different reporting requirements depending on whether you put on household equipment or non-house equipment or small or large. But this is just the weight and sorted into categories. So we'll go through the categories a bit later. And then you have to finance the recycling of the E. So register, report, and finance. So these are all super key. Now, every item of E should be marked with the crossed out wheeled bin symbol, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And under the regulations, any producers have to make sure that they inform their customers about the regulations and that they are a producer and their WEEE registration number. Perfect. So this bit is the most key bit, I think, of the presentation for everyone on listening in. So this is where we're really going to talk about whether you would be obligated under the regulations. So there's sort of, I suppose, a decision tree that you need to run through. So first of all, is the product E? Are you the producer of the E? Is the other products that you create or manufacture or import, are they exempt? And then if they're not exempt, then you need to decide what category they fall under. And then you need to decide whether they're household or non-household. So first of all, is it E? Now, all equipment is E if it depends on an electric current to work properly. So this is like a formal definition of E. But I think the first point there is the most important. If it needs a current to work properly, then it's E. Some really simple examples of this are, so it doesn't have to have a cable or a battery. It can even be an Oyster card, which has a chip in. An Oyster card needs electricity to work properly. So even that is E. So secondly, are you the producer of the E? So first of all, there are lots of manufacturers in the UK that create the product. So if you manufacture E, you're a producer, and that's in the UK. For those products that are manufactured outside of the UK, the first company to import the product would be the producer. There are some companies that rebrand E, and that would also make you a producer. That's less common, but it still does happen. And then finally, distance sellers. So for example, if you were a foreign-based company and there wasn't a company that you're importing it directly to, so there's no one to take on that first person importing it, if you're a distance seller, you're importing directly to end users in the UK. And that's why sometimes we have foreign companies registered under the regulations. So a lot of those go through platforms such as Amazon or eBay or just online. Perfect. So if anyone has any questions on whether they might be a producer, then please let me know. So thirdly, so this is really important since open scope came into force. So in 2019, as I touched on at the beginning of the presentation, open scope came into force. Now, this basically meant that DEFRA decided that they wanted to really minimize the amount of products that were excluded, and they wanted the vast majority of E to be obligated under the regulations. So they've basically narrowed down these exemptions as much as they possibly could. So if you place any E on the market, the first assumption should be that you are a producer, unless you can apply one of these exemptions or exclusions. Now, they are called exemptions and exclusions. I think it's easier just to think about it sort of, if they fall under any of these, they're exempt. So first of all, anything created or manufactured specifically for national security or military purposes. Now, this is like really specific equipment that's designed for things like the army and things. This isn't things like CCTV. Now, I know most of you, obviously, food equipment probably doesn't fall under that category. There's another one specifically designed and installed as part of a type of equipment that is excluded from the directive. So again, I think it's unlikely that any equipment would fall into that. However, this is things, so one of my go-to examples would be a sat nav that's designed to go into a car, because that sat nav will end up being thrown away with the car. Now that's only the inbuilt kind of sat navs that the example would fall under. So I'm not familiar with exactly, some of you may make, I suppose, on the go equipment, and that could fall under that one. But again, I think it's a slim chance. Now, filament bulbs also excluded. So these are rarely manufactured anyway. They're just your old fashioned bulbs. So there are sort of three big categories of exemptions. Then exclusions. So equipment designed to be sent into space. So basically no one's going to have to pick that up in the waste stream because it's going to be in space. Large scale stationary tools. Now, this exemption or this exclusion used to be stationary tools, and the following one used to be fixed installations. This is the biggest thing that's going to affect people on this webinar, fixed installations. So they've now included this definition, large scale, which changes everything. And we've had so many people contact us and being caught out by this exclusion. So if you are the producer of a fixed installation, it is now in scope. If you can argue that it's large scale, it can be excluded. Now, large scale is huge, and they've actually directed producers to the RoHS legislation and this definition. There's a definition in the RoHS guidance which defines large scale, but it's things like, does it fit on a lorry? Is it certain dimensions? You know, one example of a large scale fixed installation would be a escalator, or it would be a conveyor belt that you find in the airports, you know, huge things. So if anyone's unsure whether their equipment comes under that large scale fixed installation, then please get in touch. I think most of the items that are produced would be now in scope by this group. So then any E constituting a means of transport. So there's separate legislation for transport, so we're not worrying about those. Again, non-road mobile machinery is excluded. Then we move into B2B equipment specifically designed solely for the purposes of research and development. Now, this can sometimes be a bit confusing, but this just refers to things like prototypes that people make before they make the real thing. It's not things that are used for general research. And then finally, medical devices that are likely to be infected prior to end of life. So that's quite an obvious one. It's just things that are in vitro and things. So again, any questions on these, please get in touch. But if you are the producer of E and you can't apply any of these, it's likely that your items are in scope. There's just a couple of them to consider after this, which is components and accessories. So components are exempt from the regulations. However, we have been finding that since open scope, a lot of things that you might think are a component are actually a finished product in their own right. So it can get very confusing. So basically, if a company sells components that are so specific that, you know, they're going to be manufactured later into an item, you know, if I'm selling to an E producer that's manufacturing E, then the weight of those items shouldn't be reported twice when I make the item and then sell it to the manufacturer that makes the final product. And that's the reason that this is excluded. However, if I just sell someone a component that adds an extra function to something that would already work without it, that would be a product in its own right. So this can be really tricky to scope things. I am the chair of the industry scope panel, so we meet sort of every quarter or every 6 months to discuss hard things to scope into categories and hard things to say whether it's exempt or not. And then we send all of those to the Environment Agency. So I'm always taking sort of little components to the group. We've got another meeting next week. And then we sort of discuss what we think and send it to the Environment Agency, and they either agree or disagree. So I'm well placed to deal with this. I'm not going to pretend I've been doing it for years, but I'm still not an expert on what exactly a component would be. But we've got the contacts in the right place to be able to find out. A lot of our members have little components and things. And then accessories. So non-electrical accessories are not e-products, but if you sold an accessory with an item, it would be included in the weight. Again, it's not relevant to this group specifically, but the easiest example I can explain would be a Hoover. So you could buy a Hoover with lots of different attachments all in one box. If it's all sold in one box, then I have to report everything, including all of the attachments, which can be frustrating for some people because they're reporting a weight that's much larger than the actual specific E part of it. But that's the legislation, unfortunately. Whether that would change in the consultation, it could do. So we'll keep an eye on that. Perfect. And then finally, the categories. So again, those of you that report in Europe will notice that the categories have reduced in lots of countries. Now, the UK decided that they wanted to keep all 14. And then this is sort of the EA do some fiddling to report on an EU level in just the 6. But these are the 14 categories. So there's 10 standard categories. And then the ones that I've got in italics there are hazardous subcategories. So for example, display equipment, we can't count that as IT and telecommunications equipment because screens have a very specific waste stream. Again, cooling appliances containing refrigerants, that wouldn't be a large house appliance because that's got that has to be treated quite specifically. So yeah, scoping is great fun. I'm learning every day with scoping, but I am chair of the scoping panel, as I said. So I would imagine most of this group would fall under large household appliances. There'll be lots of equipment that's also in category 12 calling appliances. And there may be sort of monitoring and control instruments as well, things like thermometers and things like that would fall under there. But any questions about scoping, then please send them my way. So it's worth mentioning, we're going to move on to household versus non-household equipment, but these categories remain the same whether we're reporting on household or non-household, despite the slightly confusing wording, which is large household appliances, because it might not be designed for a household. For example, an industrial fridge would be a B2B item, but it's still classed as, or it would still be household appliances, or that would actually be calling, but slightly confusing wording there. We just need to sort of overlook. Perfect. So finally, in terms of scoping, household or non-household, now I would imagine a lot of the items placed in the market in this group are B2B. Some will be B2C. So products designed for use in both B2B and B2C settings have to be classed as B2C, and that they're classed as dual use. So basically, things like, what's a really good example? Like a laptop. If lots of laptops are used in the workplace, but also used at home, most laptops are dual use unless they're really specifically designed for an industrial application. So we look at the function of the item and the performance and the durability, and also size and weight, but it's really important that we think about the setting in which the product is designed for, rather than just looking at things like marketing routes. One of the really good examples is a coffee machine. So I might have a small coffee machine that's designed for my home, but then a cafe would have a more industrial coffee machine. So those more industrial coffee machines are definitely B2B. Now, I'm a consumer and I might be able to get hold of one of those industrial coffee machines if I really wanted to and have it in my home, but it's not designed for a consumer setting, and it wouldn't be classed as normal consumer behavior to have that in my home. So therefore, that's certainly a B2B item. Whereas things that you could find in both settings, such as lamps and screens and things like that, should always be classed as B2C. Again, any questions on that, please let me know. So finally, if we've decided that, if you've decided that you're an obligated producer, as said originally, there are a few things you need to do. First of all, you need to register with the Environment Agency. Now, if a company places more than 5 tons on the market, they have to register with a compliance scheme, such as B2B Compliance. If you place less than 5 tons on the market, you can go directly to the Environment Agency, although a lot of producers decide to have a compliance scheme anyway. So therefore, a compliance scheme membership is something that you're likely to need. So B2B Compliance is, as Keith said at the beginning, a not-for-profit industry-led compliance scheme. So we're quite a unique compliance scheme. We were born out of Gambika Trade Association. It shares an office, I believe, with FEA. And basically, the reason that they created us was because most compliance schemes are very focused on B2C equipment. So the true focus is on just, those companies, IT companies you find out there in Currys and things like that, that are very B2C orientated. There wasn't anyone that had really considered B2B electrical products, which are incredibly different. So our product base, when I chat to our competitors and industry groups, the products that we look after are completely different to what anyone else is used to looking after, which is quite amusing when we come to discuss scoping in the scope panel. So our standard costs, our small producer membership fee is £390 and a large producer membership fee is £775. So within that, we obviously register you with the Environment Agency, but we'd also have a key voice in policy. So for example, as I said at the beginning, there's a consultation on the WEEE regulations coming up. Now we're the only really B2B compliance scheme. We're focused on B2B products, and we represent quite a unique member base. So I've had to be part of lots of B2B groups to sort of say to DEFRA, B2C and B2B need to be handled quite differently. And I'm the only real one out there that's got the voice of the members that produce all of these weird and wonderful B2B equipment. So I've had a really key role, and we're still having lots of conversations about how we're going to do that with B2B products. At the moment, policy representation is really key. We've got lots more to do there. You also get an account manager and knowledge base and all sorts of things. We have lots of additional services as well that we can add on top of that. But most people just tend to like having, you know, the standard training, data validation, all of those standard benefits. But if you need anything above and beyond that, we never really say no to any of that. So memberships and EA costs now. So you have to register with the Environment Agency, as I said. So small producers. So as I previously said, small producers can go directly if they like. That's just £30 a year for the EA. Large producers, it depends on lots of things, where your company is registered, whether you're VAT registered, things like that. Also slightly different depending on whether you're in Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, which can make things a bit more confusing. That's just because basically there's different environment agencies in each of those regions, and some of them sort of work to slightly different plans. And then there's, so basically one of the reasons that people like going with a compliance scheme is because this is what the deadlines look like throughout the year. We have so many compliance deadlines that it's a little bit silly. So the reason that most people would go with a compliance scheme is just to handle these deadlines. So as a B2C producer, data has to be submitted quarterly. As a B2B producer, data only needs to be submitted annually in January of every year. So that's why January is an incredibly busy month for us, because we have all of our B2B members submitting data, their annual data submissions with lots of different questions. But on top of that, we need director sign off of the data. We give you certificates. And then we have to re-register everyone in November for the following year. So there's lots of different weird and wonderful deadlines by the Environment Agency. They don't like to make our lives easy. So on top of registering with a compliance scheme and the Environment Agency, there's different rules around the financing of WEEE. So you need to register as a producer if you create E, which is when you place it on the market. But when it becomes WEEE, waste electronic equipment, there's different rules to financing it. So B2C producers, large B2C producers, have to pay quarterly for the E that they placed on the market in the previous year. So throughout 2021, B2B Compliance has to procure evidence, so that's recycling evidence, to offset a company's previous year data. So if you produce any B2C items in 2020, we get all of that data in from you, and then we spend 2021 buying recycling evidence to offset that. And then we get your data and we get the evidence, and we submit both of them to the Environment Agency, and then they basically send us back a certificate to say, yes, you're compliant under the regulations. So that's the compliance scheme's responsibility, and that's why you have to join a scheme if you're a large producer. Because it's a complicated game. Now, B2B producers don't have to pay quarterly for the items placed on the market in the previous year. However, B2B producers must finance E at the end of its life, and it's their own responsibility to arrange that. So for example, if you produce B2B equipment, you have to communicate with your customers to say, we are the producer of this item, and when this item comes to the end of its life, you can contact us and we will arrange the recycling and finance the recycling of that product. So the way that B2B Compliance handles this is we just have a collections team, a great team in collections. You just request a collection from us. So basically your customer can either directly request the collection from us and state you as the producer, or you can do it for us on the behalf of your customer. Then basically we'll go out and we'll find a quote for you, and then we'll give the quote and you give us the yes or no. We'll go and collect the equipment and sort out the sound recycling, and we've got suppliers that basically have signed off by the Environment Agency as being approved, authorized treatment facilities and things like that, and we do all the checks and things like that. So yeah, two very different systems. As I say, we are working there's a consultation, and in that consultation we are talking about the different systems for financing WEEE. Lots of you will be aware of extended producer responsibility. So obviously they want to put more responsibility on the producer, but that needs to look very different for B2B producers than it looks for B2C producers. We have people that put, equipment that weighs tons on the market, but the electronic component of it might be tiny, and it's unfair to make those producers pay for the full weight as if it's all going through a WEEE recycling route. So yeah, lots of thinking. We're busy thinking about that at the moment, ready for the consultation in Q2. Hopefully the consultation will be. So if you're a B2C producer, I'll quickly run over this. It's not just the amount of E you place on the market that we have to buy evidence for. We basically work that out by using your market share, and then we have to times it by the DEFRA recycling target to work out your obligation. So here is an example. So it's basically, this bit is just your market share of everyone in the UK, and that's multiplied by the DEFRA target to make your obligation. Now, these are the DEFRA targets for last year. They're still thinking about them for this year. So who knows what they'll be. Actually, I think these are the ones for the previous year. We've had all sorts of different adjustments for the targets. We had COVID adjusted targets. Who knows what they'll do for 2021. I'm in the middle of looking through data and collections data, trying to, DEFRA are quite open to advice on that. So I'm in the midst of trying to look through data, trying to think of what on earth a fair target might be for 2021, which is an impossible task. But basically that affects B2C obligations. So it's really key for our B2C producers that we look into it for them. And then finally, so this is just running through like the distributor obligations. So for B2B items, as this says, it's the producers that must always arrange and pay for the sound treatment. So you could have a take back scheme. This can all just be done through B2B compliance. We sort all of this out for you. Even if you weren't a member of B2B compliance scheme, we could still help you with the collections if you needed that with our collections team. So super simple. If you're a distributor of B2CE, you have an obligation to advertise how those consumers can bring it back to you. So I think this will apply to not very many of the people on the call, but it basically means you need to take the equipment in free of charge and arrange for the recycling. Ultimately, if you're a distributor of B2CE, you don't pay really for the financing of it because you've already paid that at the beginning of the system. The way the system works, it sort of funds itself, but you do have to take the item back into store. As I say, I don't think many of you will be affected by this, but if you are, feel free to let me know. And we can discuss it a bit further. I'm going to leave that bit there though, because I don't think many of you will be affected by that. Okay, so that was a whistle-stop tour, but it's so complicated, and I know it's so complicated. So if there are those of you on the call that are a bit baffled by what I've said, please get in touch and we can go through it in bite-sized chunks, and just talk about it specifically on your company basis. It's much easier sometimes when a company comes to us, if we can talk really specifically for what the regulations mean for a specific company rather than as a whole, because it can get super complicated. Have you got any questions?
Thank you, Lucy. I have one question to start off with. Will you be able to have these slides available to distribute to our members?
Yeah, of course. I can send the slides over to you, and then yeah, feel free to distribute them. Any more information, we've got sort of information packs and things available if anyone wants one of those as well. So yeah, definitely.
Great, thank you. The first question that's come into the chat is regarding end users.
Yes.
What responsibilities do pubs or restaurants have when it comes to disposal of a commercial microwave oven?
So a commercial microwave oven would be a B2B item. So that falls under the B2B regulations. So under the regulations, it's the producer's responsibility to dispose of that. So the pubs and restaurants would need to contact the producer to arrange the disposal of it. Now, strictly under the regulations, the producer can charge for the transport back to their own site and then can arrange sort of treatment from there. What we often find is we find that a lot of our members just pay for the collection from their customer site because it's going to be the same collection cost from the customer or their site, and then arrange the treatment. Unfortunately, one of the flaws in the regulations are that sometimes that pub or restaurant might not have a clue about the regulations, and they might not have a clue who's responsible. And unfortunately, that means that sometimes we can end up in the wrong place. Mm-hmm. Now, we advise, and it is under the regulations, that producers need to be communicating with their customers on how to dispose of that product. Obviously, sales chains can be long, and you would hope that the message is passed along the chain. It's basically one of the things that B2B producers have to do as well is list it on their website. So if that pub or restaurant were to check the producer website, then they should be able to find the information on how to return it. But yeah, it is one of the flaws in the system that often the end users aren't familiar. But strictly, it would be the responsible of the end user to contact the producer of the item to arrange the disposal.
Okay, makes sense. The second question is, we've spoken about importing from the EU on many occasions. Can we presume that importing from other countries, such as the US, can fall into this category?
Yeah, it's exactly the same. Importing into the UK is exactly the same regulations. Anything that's imported into the UK falls under the regulations. Reason I mentioned the EU so many times is because that directive covers the EU. So at B2B Compliance, we do have an international compliance department that covers all of the legislation in all of the different countries. I don't think there's the same legislation if you're importing to other countries other than those European countries. It doesn't tend to be the same, although there are some with the legislation. So yeah, anything imported into the UK falls under these UK legislation and regulations.
Great. I would encourage anybody else who has got a question to type it into the chat. We do have one that's coming from a member company called Loop Cycle. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They're a new FEA member. He says, recycling and resource recovery offsets the impact of WEEE, correct?
Yeah, so this is something that is going to be way better when the consultation has gone through and we've got the new legislation. At the moment, it's helpful, but it won't be as great as it will be. So obviously, reusing is strongly encouraged, and that you can gain evidence from reusing instead of recycling. So to offset an obligation, we could buy reuse evidence, which works in the same way. And we often find that B2B members have circular business models, which is great. The nature of their items means it's easier. Now, at the moment in the B2C system, so that the consumer products, so as I say, we can use reuse evidence to offset obligations, so it's beneficial to the regulations. However, there are some issues at the moment when something's classified as WEEE, waste, it can't be reused just due to the components within it, and there's some sticking points at the moment which we're just working through. However, always remember for both systems, when an item is reused and then placed back on the market, that doesn't need to be reported. It should only be reported on its first journey through the system. So when it's imported or manufactured, it needs to be reported. But those companies won't need to report on the items that are reused, so their obligations are going to be lowered. Now, we're talking in the consultation, and the government are really keen to incentivize reuse and to incentivize these circular business models. So it's likely in the future that it will be hugely beneficial under the regulations if you are reusing or if you do have a circular business model. At the moment, it's not quite as endorsed as we would like. It's beneficial, but it's not as beneficial as it will be in the future. But it's definitely something that is going to be central to the regulations going forward once this consultation sort of run through and started being implemented. In reality, we've got a consultation this year. The absolute beginning that those new regulations will come into force would be 2023. It's likely it will be 2024 before we start seeing that. But in the future, it's definitely something that will be hugely beneficial.
And Lucy, that consultation will be part, presumably, the Environment Bill.
Yes, it is. So they're consulting on, basically, they've brought in extended producer responsibility, haven't they? And they're really focusing on that and the circular economy. So it's all part of that. And we've got consultations on packaging, WEEE and batteries.
One thing I would say, and it may help, and I'm sure some of you will on the call will have the question of why commercial food service equipment is under the household category. And this was principally because by their own admission, this was a poorly drafted directive in the first instance. And that's why it took from the early 2000s until 2005 for it to be transposed into UK law. And certainly we were part of that discussion, both within Europe with the Commission on behalf of EFSEM, the European Federation of Catering Equipment Manufacturers. And we had several meetings with the Commission on this, who of course then disowned the poor directive that they drafted and said, well, it's for the member states to transpose because that's the role of a directive. And then certainly in our discussions with the DTI, as was then, at the final element of the discussion, it was deemed that commercial food service equipment fell under the household category because it was of a similar nature and volume as household equipment. So that's just a little bit of background, but the work that Lucy and the team are doing in representing all of this is to try and give the clarity of the scoping and the implementations. And certainly with the recast of the WEEE directive, WEEE 2 as it currently is, and the widening of scope, it's the principle that nothing goes to landfill. And that's been true since the start. And that's about effective reprocessing. And as we know in this market, none of our equipment ever went to landfill anyway because of the intrinsic value in the product. There was too much of an established scrap structure to take what was scrap and reprocess it so it had a reuse and second life. And just to finish up, my understanding from many of the stainless steel providers is that approximately 3/4 of new stainless steel that's put on the market has recycled product as part of it. So it's already a very highly recycled product and has been for many years, as we know.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning that most catering equipment now would be B2B. Obviously, from 2005 may have been a different story. Certainly now most of it will be B2B. If it's so similar to something B2C, then it will be B2C. But yeah, most of it is B2B. You're right, in terms of scrap as well. One of the problems we do have with the legislation is that these things do have such a high value as scrap, it's super important that we go through an authorized route when disposing of these items, so that the WEEE part of the items is disposed of correctly, and then perhaps the rest of it would go down like a scrap metal type of route, which is always part of it. But we can find that sometimes that B2BE isn't quite dealt with properly, because it's got such high value, as you say, but it's much more circular as well due to that high value. So definitely good.
And of course, there's been a tightening up of the scrap markets in that they can no longer take cash or provide cash in exchange for scrap. There's been a systemization of the process in order to ensure there's greater traceability, and that helps lead to being able to achieve those targets that DEFRA have set.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Great. I've got two questions that are product specific. The first is, are cold rooms or refrigeration walk-in products in the scope of fixed appliances?
So I would probably say that unfortunately, probably not. So I think they would fall under the regulations. For that person that's asked that question, what I'll do is I will send you over the snippet of the definition of large scale. And if you think you can apply that definition to the product, then that's fine, it's excluded. What we tend to tell our members, we give them that information and we say, you know, if you decide based on this definition that the item is large scale, then just make sure you've got that in your sort of WEEE methodology process internally, so that if the Environment Agency did knock on your door and say, are you including these or reporting on these, you can say, these particular products we've decided are exempt, and this is the basis of that. So it's really like up to you to really think about the products and think whether those apply. We can give you all of the advice though. And yeah, that specific person, please email me or email our general inbox, and we'll definitely get back in touch with the specific legislation on that, so you can really apply it to the specific products in mind. It might be that you have some of the smaller ones are in scope, and it might be that then they get to a certain size and then they're out of scope. We do see that often as well with some products. So you'll just have to think about specifically what you've got.
Okay. Then the next question is commercial kitchen ventilation systems under B2B?
Yes. So the only B2C ventilation systems would be like things that are just available for me. So, you know, like air conditioning units that I could buy for my home, that are just the ones that are quite simple that I can buy. That would be a B2C item. But any proper and B2B, you know, designed for industrial kitchens, like proper commercial kitchens, that would definitely be B2B. It might be out of scope if it's the type that's sort of built into a building, like and you couldn't just take it out and replace it, then that wouldn't be in scope under the regulations. But if it's one that you can just replace and install a new one, that would be under the regulations as B2B.
Okay. Great. We don't have any other further questions unless somebody types really quickly.
That's fine. Well, I'm really happy to answer questions after the webinar. So email me, or even if you get in touch with Jocelyn, I'm sure she can forward it over. So yeah, really happy for any questions. So just let me know.
Okay, thank you for that. And it really just leaves me to say thank you to Jocelyn for arranging the call, and to Lucy for a very clear but concise and well presented delivery of the presentation today. It is a complex area, and it's good to hear that Lucy and the team will be willing to answer any specific questions that you might have. We'll happily pass any questions that come into us on to Lucy. And Lucy, I think also we should work collaboratively towards the consultation, because I know there are points that we've got in terms of what we think would help with the evolution of the scoping of WEEE and its implementation, so that it minimises the detrimental effect that it can have on the market, particularly in these challenging times. And I think also the role that, as we've talked about, that recycling and reuse have, working collaboratively. I think this is a nuance that we need to ensure that we get across the government, because certainly we see that a lot of new equipment coming onto the market that is more sustainable, perhaps in terms of its energy use or other greater values to the operator means that old redundant equipment can be taken off the market. So we get some, we start to more effectively address the challenge of getting to net zero carbon by 2050. So I think we should see what we can do there, and we'll be pleased to work with you on that. But
certainly.
It really just leaves me to thank all of you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you on our next FEA webinar. Thank you all very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.